one point of clarification for us after that very excellent presentation by Sushira is just to give you an example of what a multiple use product would be versus a limited use. And that's pretty simple for us to understand. TNF inhibitors have multiple uses, multiple indications, not just ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, but as you know, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, psoriatic arthritis, et cetera, whereas an agent like another biologic like vedolizumab is only indicated for ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease and doesn't have the multiple other uses. And I hope that may help put it into perspective. There's been a lot of concern amongst gastroenterologists over the years in the United States, and previously there was a lot of concern by gastroenterologists in Europe over the use of biosimilars. Indeed, it was about 4 years ago, 5, I can't remember exactly, when ECHO presented a position statement that was actually against the use of biosimilars. And biosimilars were subsequently introduced into Europe and are used extensively now in Asia. And an updated ECHO position paper says they're here, they're now, we're using them. And without the same kind of reservations. So I believe it's going to be the same in the United States. There's a lot of angst because of the uncertainties and the unknowns to those of us who have not been familiar with the use of biosimilars. But I think as they come into the marketplace and are more extensively used, we will come to an appropriate level of comfort. As far as the interchangeability is concerned, I don't know how many of you were here at the ACG conference only a few weeks ago, where the ACG hosted a conference held by the FDA regarding biosimilars. And one of the issues that comes up is that none of the biosimilars have been approved for interchangeability, and Sushira is absolutely right. But I think we may be confronted by interchangeability in practice as our insurance companies and the third-party payers are negotiating with companies that are providing or developing biosimilars on a year-to-year basis. So this year they may approve infliximab, the originator. Next year they may approve the Merck biosimilar, and the year after the Pfizer biosimilar. And we may be confronted by switches along the way. And that really hasn't been addressed on a pragmatic basis. I'm not actually very worried about it, but the concern is, does something that has been compared to infliximab, does A equal B and B equals A, does that mean B equals C? And we have not seen that yet, and there have not been interchangeability trials to this point. At the present time, we have 2 biosimilars for Inflectra that have been FDA approved and that are currently marketed. Inflectra, previously known as CTP13, was approved a year ago in 2016, and Renflexis was approved in April of this year and has been available since the fall. Now, what's of interest to you are several products that are biosimilars to adalimumab or to Humira. These have been approved. Amjevita, an Amgen product, has been approved by the FDA, but neither that nor a product from Boehringer Ingelheim, also, I can't remember whether it's approved, but neither are marketed it is approved, and neither have been marketed, not because of the lack of FDA approval, but because of patent issues regarding the use of these agents that are currently being litigated and are in process. And so it's unlikely that we're going to see biosimilars for Humira for another several years, again, pending litigation. There are also some additional biosimilars that are approved and are available outside the United States in the European Union, Amjevita, Salambic, Imraldi. You have to be European to be able to pronounce those, as well as Inflectra and Remsima, and another third product, Flixeba, are all approved in Europe, and they are being inserted into the European marketplace, as we will hear. And indeed, over the past decade, and actually 17 years, there have been approval of a number of different biosimilars not related to inflammatory bowel disease in Europe. These include erythropoietin biosimilars, also biosimilars to filgrastim, and several years ago, infliximab biosimilars, and now insulin biosimilars, etanercept, Enbrel biosimilars, and then several others are evolving. So this is a process that is gathering speed and steam as the originator products are coming off patent or their patents are being challenged by biosimilar companies. So we can see in green now that there is a rise in both the use of biologic agents, and this pertains to infliximab, but you can see as of 2 years ago in green, now 30% of prescriptions in Europe, and this is expanding. This was data from a year ago, and I suspect it's close to 50% of European prescriptions are now being utilized as biosimilars. And similarly, we see increases in the economics and the sales and spending of biosimilars that are increasing in Europe. As the entire field of biologics are increasing, we're seeing a similar but 15-year or so lag behind with the biosimilars for each originator product. There has been a recent meta-analysis of 19 studies comparing biosimilars to reference anti-TNF biologics. And these include studies in inflammatory bowel disease that have been done outside the United States. The bottom line is there have not been any differences or significant differences that have been noted across these different trials in numerous indications, including psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, and also in inflammatory bowel disease where these have been tested, and I'll summarize some of these. Now, a lot of both complacency as well as concern came out of what is known as the Norwich study. As you are very well aware, and we talked about this yesterday morning, economics are increasingly important, and increasingly important in Europe as well as the United States. And of course, the healthcare systems are somewhat different and mostly government controlled outside the US and in Europe. And in Norway, with the availability of the biosimilar to infliximab, Norway mandated that patients who are on Remicade at the time be randomized to either continue the originator Remicade or be switched to CTP-13, which is Inflectra in the United States, across all of the indications, not just inflammatory bowel disease, but as I mentioned, rheumatoid arthritis as well as psoriasis. As far as the findings, there were no significant differences across the indications. There was a little bit of controversy regarding the biosimilar in Crohn's disease because the outcome in a relatively small population bordered near the confidence intervals that were used, although they did not cross the confidence intervals. Again, because of the small number of patients, this provided some concern about the reliability, but nevertheless, we've seen consistency in other trials in both ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease with the biosimilars to infliximab. As far as the Norwich data, this is the pedogram regarding that, and you can see that none of the biosimilar indications, and Crohn's disease just does come up to that confidence level, but none of them are unique and outside the lines of confidence that were designed for this particular trial. As far as the efficacy and safety of CTP-13 in small trials around the world, primarily in Asia, and many of these, since the drug was initially developed in Korea, several of these were Asian trials. And again, what we see is that there is no significant difference between Inflectra and infliximab, what we know as Remicade here, across these different trials. The meta-analysis also looked at safety, and there was no difference in safety or efficacy compared to the originator infliximab. In Crohn's disease, there were similar results, biosimilar results, that there were no significant differences in clinical trials. And several weeks ago at the European meeting, again, a multi-switch trial with Inflectra, which has not yet been published, was presented and demonstrated no differences between the patients who were switched back and forth versus patients who were treated consistently. And we'll see that data once it's published shortly. As far as efficacy and safety, again, in the meta-analysis, as far as sustained clinical remission in ulcerative colitis, there were no significant differences in several trials, and sustained clinical remission rates appeared to be the same in ulcerative colitis. There were some recent reports from this year's Digestive Disease Week that we have been able to assimilate. There was a randomized controlled trial of the biosimilar, again, Inflectra versus the originator, and in the setting of Crohn's disease, and no differences were seen between the biosimilar and the originator. And what's known as the PROCIT trial, again from Europe, looked at about 700 patients, mixture of ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease from a variety of different settings, who many of whom had had previous exposure. So over 4,000 infusions looking for safety signals did not identify any differences in safety or clinical efficacy in this observational cohort of patients. In a phase 3 randomized double-blind control trial comparing the biosimilar infliximab with infliximab in active Crohn's disease. This study, I think, was done in Italy. Again, demonstrated similar efficacy and similar safety. And then a final study actually looked at the use. And the purpose of having the biosimilar pathway was to actually lower the cost and increase access to patients to these highly effective and expensive therapies. And what this UK study demonstrated that indeed the short-term efficacy and safety appeared equivalent, but the pattern of use was increasing, and indeed more patients were allowed access to the biosimilars to the biologic therapy over the interval of this trial. Now, I mentioned in 2013, look at the light blue here in the ECHO survey. They weren't very favorable about it. And then once they reached the marketplace and began to be utilized, we see improved confidence of gastroenterologists with the use of these for inflammatory bowel disease. So there still remain a number of questions. What does similarity mean to a clinician, and how is it different from a generic? Well, Suchira actually discussed that. Was the biosimilar ever studied? We are seeing increasing, not huge studies, but increasing smaller studies across the world that have demonstrated similar clinical effectiveness and safety. As far as immunogenicity is concerned, animal studies do not inform us very well. So you need to use clinical studies to look at immunogenicity, and these are done outside of inflammatory bowel disease often. but we have not seen any change in the immunogenicity pattern of these agents. And then finally, essentially repeating what Sushera has actually told you, and this is the same kind of summary slide that she said, and so we can move on with David's presentation. Thank you.